behind. When all the world seems in tune, and love goes on softly on. So don't be sighing or crying, dear, if winter comes.
Hi, welcome to another Lawyers, Guns, and Money podcast about Game of Thrones. I'm Scott R. Kaufman.
I'm Steve Atwell.
And today we'll be discussing the Watchers on the Wall, about which I think we have very divergent opinions. But I'll let Stephen get us started.
Okay, so we start with sort of the, at this point, kind of traditional pre-battle lull. And we get kind of two interesting little parallel scenes in which, on the one hand, you have Sam and Jon talking about life, about love, about women, about duty, and then we sort of transition with the significant owl hooting in the night over to the Wildlings, who are also talking about love and about duty and about death.
They are, but the whole time they're also talking very much about kind of simplistic notions of masculinity. And even though it's sort of undermined for a moment with Ygritte, talking about how she doesn't want to hear again about the dead bear he didn't fuck, it's still... What we have here is we have this first sort of juvenile conversation between Sam and Jon, and then we have a big dick contest going on with the Wildlings, and it didn't get off. The episode didn't get off to an auspicious start for me. I didn't find the sort of pre-battle talk. I know what it was supposed to do, sort of ground these characters, make their fear and anxiety apparent. What if I never get to fuck anyone? Quit talking about fucking bears. But it felt sort of...
Yeah, but is it any different from the same scene that happened in Blackwater?
In Blackwater, though, it was... If I'm thinking of the same scene, it was when Sansa and Cersei were talking about...
No.
That's further on in the episode. I didn't rewatch Blackwater.
The scene I'm talking about is Bronn and the Hound in the brothel.
Well, I mean, that scene, I think, works a little better in part because of the tension between them.
Right, but there's tension built literally almost identically between Ygritte and the head of the Thanes.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess
what I'm saying is I'm finding the criticism of this episode a little bit, how shall I put it, unmindful of the past. I mean, I think Blackwater got a lot of credit when it came out, but I think we're forgetting that, there were some not good things in Blackwater, and they still don't, in the long run, diminish our enjoyment of that episode.
Well, but I mean, I guess I'll put my cards on the table and say I didn't really have that much enjoyment of this episode because it was a very competently done remake of the Battle of Helm's Deep from the Two Towers or any number of other battle scenes. I was literally bored watching it. Like, please, God, let this be fucking over. Because I have to write about it. And when I start having to think about writing about an episode before it's even done, that's never a good sign.
Okay, but, I mean, that could equally point to your lack of engagement versus the show's lack of execution. Well, no, I think... How much of this is just that you happen to like certain characters more than other characters? Because I think a big part of this is, this episode is entirely at the wall. So, it depends very much in terms of, how much do you care if Sam lives or dies? How much do you care if, Ygritte and Jon meet? I think these are signifying questions versus, the people at King's Landing.
Well, I'm not someone who hates Jon or, compares him to Dishwater or anything. I actually quite like the character. I like his dynamic with Sam. I'm interested in what's going on the wall because it's actually the most important sort of element of the show, really, is what's going on up there. The King's Landing is sort of a distraction, but we just have that sort of backwards because of the amount of time the show is spent on what goes on at King's Landing. I mean, what's really important is what's coming down from the north, who's coming up from the south, and they're all going to meet here at the Wall. This is sort of the culmination of all 4 seasons, this battle. This is what we've been... And we can go back and look at the fact that the very first scene in the first episode was north of the Wall. I mean, this is a long time coming, and it felt like it was trying to be epic. It just fell flat for me. I mean, it was very competently directed. It was very well done. I'm not knocking Marshall's direction. I mean, he's the same guy who directed Blackwater. I wasn't, and it wasn't really Jon and Sam. I guess it was everybody else who I recognized, and Dolores Ed and Gren and all of them, but I had no real connection to.
Right, but I mean, let me put it this way: we've known Pip and Gren for 4 seasons now, right? We've spent as much time with them as we have with a lot of the secondary cast, so. You should care whether they lived or died.
Yeah, but I didn't.
But how much of that is the show? Because I got to tell you, as someone who's read the books and who very much, knows that, here's a bit of a spoiler: Pip and Gren don't die in the books. Their death really did get me.
Well, I guess that's a good point. And again, what we've been saying all season, that they are, at a certain point, the series is becoming an adaptation of the book in a looser sense, and I for the most part approve of that in terms of it allows me to be surprised even though I've read the books. I guess I just they didn't even sort of give me enough on the previously on Game of Thrones to sort of remember why I should really be invested in Pip's death. And also there was a real disconnect between the sort of epic quality of his death and the amount of time that they spent on the show. Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't. Because, I honestly felt that the tunnel sequence was the best part of the episode.
I'll agree with you there. I thought that was the one that worked. But we'll get to that. We should keep on going. Okay. Largely the episode.
Yeah. So I will say I don't think this episode is without flaws, and honestly, I think part of the difference maybe between this and the Blackwater is the fact that the Blackwater was written by George R. R. Martin, and this wasn't. So the next scene between Sam and Maester Aemon, where they're sort of talking about old age and love, and there is an interesting thing about, the stories that the Wildlings tell about the Night's Watch versus the stories that the Night's Watch tells about the Wildlings, but I just don't feel it was as proficiently done. At the same time, we do get this interesting little maturation moment where, Sam actually kind of is able to exert his will in, opening the gate for Gilly, making this exception, and then, actually committing to her.
I agree. I mean, it was no less than what I would expect from Sam. I mean, that is wholly in line with his character as he's been developing now.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure it is in the sense that I do think it is a step forward for his character, but compare it to his kind of dithering about Molestown earlier this season.
Well, but I mean, they sort of set up what he would do with all of his worrying in the previous episode about what could become of her, and they tried to build up his confidence that she must have survived because look at all the other things that she survived. So when he saw that she had survived, it wasn't really a surprise that he, did what he did.
So anyway, we go from there to the. And it's interesting that the moment of sighting the actual Wildlings happens kind of off screen, that we get these blasts from the horn, and we get the owl seeing the biggest fire that the North has ever seen, which is quite impressive. It's this enormous forest fire, and we see the Wildlings start to emerge.
Seemingly unafraid of anything that might descend upon them.
Yeah, and we get this sort of nice kind of sequence in which the Knight's Wall is preparing up at the top of the wall, and Sir Alistair, who honestly, took an enormous step forward in this episode from someone who, has always been kind of a one-note
a dick.
Yeah, a dick. A lot of people were sort of surprised at how well he comes off in this episode as someone who is still a dick, but at least is someone committed to the wall who sort of sees his own shortcomings, and kind of teaches Jon something about leadership, which I thought was kind of an interesting change.
But it was all sort of couched in the, noble cliches of people going off to war and battle for the. I mean, there was, this is when everyone likes, the gunnery sergeant in Full Metal Jacket when they realize that you've been preparing me to go to war for real this whole time.
See, I don't buy that. Because, one, the gunnery sergeant in Full Metal Jacket is shown as such an incompetent that he provokes a mentally ill man into shooting him to death. And two, this isn't about the hoary cliches, right? This is a discussion between an officer who's tried to murder one of his own men and his subordinate dealing with, this kind of question of, what do you do when people are second-guessing you? I did think that is kind of an interesting way forwards.
Okay.
I mean, the one criticism, and here's where I'm trying to draw kind of a line here, is that this next scene with Sam in which he says, that's what men do. That didn't work for me. I didn't think that was necessary. I thought there was a better way for Sam to express the fact that, Gilly is not going to be safe if the wall falls, and, that he has an obligation to do something about that. But on the flip side, I really did like the scene between Sam and Pip in the yard when they're stacking arrows, and Sam is sort of talking about, how he got over his fear of coming face to face with something a lot more dangerous than a wildling.
Well, just to take a step back for 1 second, I'll say that I agree with you. I do not like that "this is what a man does" thing, because that seemed to be becoming a theme in the episode. This is what men do on the eve of battle. This is what men talk about. This is what men are. And I just found all of that sort of tiresome. But
yeah, sure. I thought that could have been cut quite easily. But, the sequence that comes next when Ygritte and the wildlings sort of charge the gate while the wildling, while you're seeing literal giants on mammoths emerging out of the forest, and the Night Watch kind of girding itself to deal with these threats. On a level of spectacle, it succeeds admirably.
Oh, I'd agree with you completely. I mean, as I was saying, I think technically this was incredibly well done.
Right, but I think there's an emotional side to the technical there, to the technical side. Right? It's we're taking a figure who has only been seen as a dick, right? And giving him a kind of a heroic place, which is fairly unusual. It's also about showing that the giants grieving for one another, for example. That's important. The one thing that I did miss in this sequence was I felt it could have done well with having Mance Rayder cutting back to him directing the attack, because it felt kind of one-sided, and the parallel for me here is the movie Zulu.
Okay.
In terms of a small group of soldiers defending a fixed position against a much larger force that's coming in all around them, albeit this time it's got giants and mammoths. But we do get some interesting kind of ways of spacing out the time so that it's not just kind of nothing but fighting. So, for example, the sort of the mini play in which Janos Slint is commanding the wall and gets and has to be chivied out of his position because he's just lost his damn mind. One of the things I really liked about this kind of first fight sequence is the Marshall's amazing use of geography, where you really understand where everyone is, such that you can follow, say, Pip and Sam as they're retreating, or you can follow Tormund as he's sort of charging his way into the sort of the lower castle, or you can see the climbers coming up. Meanwhile, as the giants are setting up Mammoths to pull the gates down. So, I thought that worked really well.
I wouldn't say that's just Marshall though, because I mean they've been establishing the geography of the wall for the entire series essentially, going back to Jon's first.
They redid the entire set for this episode.
Exactly. I mean, we'd already.
But also, and he's showing parts of the set we've never seen before. We've seen the courtyard, the training yard, but we've never seen that southern gate that Sam and Pip are fighting at. And, where it exists in relation to the wall, and where the road is that the Fens are fighting to get up, and where that is in relation to the tunnels, and where that is in relation to the winch. I think, Marshall has done an amazing job of making this geography so clear that even though he's filled up the space with people, fighting chaotically, you still know exactly where everyone is and what everyone's doing. And that's what, to me, kind of made this episode more than just a fight sequence, is that you could understand what was going on and make sense of it as it was happening.
And that's why I'd say it was a very well-directed fight sequence, and I think you're right. There was a lot added that hadn't been previously shown, but they and I will give Marshall credit for creating a competent sequence that didn't descend into contemporary film cliches of fight sequences where all you see are arms, swords, and elbows, and you have no real sense, right, of who is doing what to whom, what the stakes of any individual encounter in a battle are. He does make it all meaningful.
Yeah, and especially this sequence coming up where, there's a lot of movement of people, right? Jon is sending Gren down into the inner gate, even though he knows that means, that Gren's going to die. The bit where the burning barrels fall down and the mammoth squishes, and squishes Wildlings and goes panicking back. The moment where a giant is killed, and another giant, lifts up the door, and then the men inside, and that's what I liked about the tunnel sequences. I felt it was a kind of a microcosm of the overall fight, where the question is, how does an outnumbered, bunch of people faced with this kind of overwhelming threat that they're not really prepared for, do they decide to stand and fight, given that not doing so means everything falls?
Well, yeah, I don't think they really had a choice but to stand and fight,
one guy clearly wanted to run.
Well, yeah, but I mean, if they all run, Giant just gets in, and then...
No, but that is a choice, right? I mean, that's the choice that the three Night's Watchmen at the very beginning of, Season 1 faced, right? Do you stand and fight, or do you run? So, yeah, I think there is a choice, right? And I think that's the whole purpose of the Oath, is that Gren is using it to, essentially make a very quick argument in favor of why they should stay and fight, even though they're probably going to die. Is, bringing it back to this obligation of duty to a larger humanity.
And it's also an argument from training, and this has been drilled into their heads. This is what they have been training for. So,
well, I mean, yes and no, because the men who mutinied against Mormont at Craster's Keep had the same training. I think it's more a question of. I think it is more a question of choice. That that these 6 men hold, and that is just enough to save the Watch. Because if they hadn't, then the inner gate falls, the Wildlings come pouring through, and Westeros is pretty much screwed.
Yes, there's no day 2.
So another sort of small criticism I have is the one sequence once Jon and Sam have gone down to kind of turn the tide against the Southern assault, Ghost gets free and kills exactly 1 person, which I was sort of like, you really could have done more with that. If you want to show why it is that all of a sudden the attack on the South is failing, why not show this warg actually having an impact? But it was, sorry, go ahead.
Well, one of the things that was sort of confusing to people who haven't read the book was that first-person perspective actually ghosts, or were we supposed to imagine that?
Yeah, it was ghosts.
Well, I know, but people who hadn't read the books, they were confused because we had the warg feature prominently earlier in the episode with the owl, and so they were wondering, wait, are we going to...
Do owls run on the ground?
Hmm?
Do owls run on the ground?
Well, no.
Because that POV was from the ground.
Well, I know, but I guess the confusion was, are we seeing Ghost's perspective, or are we supposed to think of this as another warg moment where someone is inside of Ghost attacking for him? Which, again, it's something that you and I had no problem understanding, but was confusing to people who hadn't read the books.
I didn't run into anybody who was confused by that. I mean, I felt like they had done enough preparatory work in seasons 1 through 3, so that when we know that it goes to first, person and it's moving like that is the POV of a wolf. Anyway, and then we get, a bit that, I think part of the question about, did you buy this episode or did you not, is the scene between Ygritte and Jon. Do you care that they've encountered each other, and whether or not she can actually kill him, and what it means, when, they're sort of reconciling in death.
I thought the scene, if it had been cut maybe 2/3 of it out, especially the last line, would have worked for me.
That's weird, because I read other people who said that it felt a little bit rushed.
It felt like there was an entire hour compressed in between the time that she was shot and the time when she uttered her last words. And it's part because I knew the words were coming, and they handled it so clumsily. And this is like the one part of the episode I don't think was directed well, was you knew what she was going to say.
Well...
And they just kept dragging it out in a way that heightened...
Hang on. I mean, how exactly did they drag it out? She says, do you remember that cave? We should have stayed in that cave. And then he says, you're not going to die. And then she says, you know nothing, Jon Snow. It's like 3 lines.
Yeah, it takes like 15 minutes.
I would recommend going back and watching that bit again. It does not take 15 minutes.
It felt like 15 minutes. It felt like it dragged out forever. And it might have just been the inevitability of that last line. That when you know where the conversation's headed, you can either be anticipating it, with joy and then get the sort of release that you get when you get what you know what's coming, or with dread. And I definitely looked at it with dread, and I was thinking, please don't say it, oh motherfucker. It was the low point of the episode for me.
I didn't feel that at all.
Well,
and I knew it was coming. So, I don't know where you ding it, If they hadn't had it, then, you'd have huge numbers of fans of the books who are pissed off that she doesn't get her last line.
But that would actually have been great if she didn't get her last line, because it would be hanging there unspoken forever. If they had cut away right when Jon Snow said, "You're going to make it," and then she went, "Ugh," we would have had the line in our head anyway. She was proven.
Well, you would have, because you're remembering the books, but I don't think the show watchers would.
Oh, they remember.
I think there's a reason that, repetition matters. You actually do have to remind people who haven't read the books 3 or 4 times over.
Well, but you can also beat dead horses, and I guess that line for her became a dead horse for me. And I was like, please don't let her go off on that. And then she did.
Yeah, I think there's something wrong with your soul. So anyway, next we get the Scythe, which I thought was a hilarious addition. And some people have been speculating that they put in the Scythe because they'd taken out the chain from the Blackwater.
Yeah, that was, I think, my favorite moment of the episode, actually.
Yeah, that was really visually impressive.
And, people kept on... I was reading a review where people were complaining that why did they stop firing the arrows? And it's like, the thing looks like it's pretty heavy. Like, you'd need the people who were firing arrows to,
winch it.
Yeah. But yeah, I thought that was a great moment, beautifully rendered. The budget for the show obviously has increased over time. But again, even though it was a great moment, I still it reminded me that I was watching like an action movie, and that's not normally how I watch Game of Thrones.
I mean, I would say that the same moment is there in Blackwater. When the ships go boom, that is about as big an action movie moment as you can get.
Yeah, but I don't know, it was grounded in all of the planning that Tyrion had done, all of the talk of the Hound and fire. There was a lot more to the appearance of Wildfire than there was with this thing that I didn't see coming, and I guess it was surprising in that respect.
Well, how much grounding do you need? It's siege weaponry. I don't really see the necessity to, ground it in character in that moment. I thought the more interesting thing was, when Jon and Tormund run into each other, for example. Or when, Sam and Jon are kind of asking themselves, well, what's next? Who's left to give orders? What does it actually mean? Is this a great victory? Or, how do we actually end this? And then, the part that really got me is when you see the dead giant in Gren. And, the realization of, what they accomplished. And the fact that, Gren has done something that, in the world that he lives in, would normally make you a legend. People would tell stories of Gren the Giant Slayer. But instead he is a nameless, person who died down in the dark, but who nonetheless was responsible for saving an entire kingdom.
Well, they give Jon the moment of bending over and recognizing him, which suggests that he's not going to be forgotten, and that his
but, his body's going to be burned. No one south of the Wall is going to know his name.
I don't know. Right up.
Which pulls, back to, Corrin Halfhand in season 2, when, the whole point was, you're not going to be remembered. You're not going to be a hero, but, we want you to fight for your life.
I guess, the nameless, faceless death of war is something that I should have found more moving, even though I knew who Gren was. I should have found it more moving than I did. I guess it was just too wrapped up in the war film cliches for me to really feel this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, because I was watching responses, and I was wondering, the people who seem to have gone into this episode from a meta perspective. A lot of people, like, for example, people who are like, oh, I didn't really feel that much because I knew that Jon and Sam had plot armor. Didn't get very much from it. So I think there's a level of, you also know that Batman isn't going to die in a Batman movie. But, you have to, at a certain level, as an audience member, be willing to emotionally engage with what you're dealing with.
Well, Batman might not, but everyone around him might. In the same way that certain characters in Game of Thrones won't die, but everyone around them might. And you can be emotionally engaged with them. I guess it's just, it feels like the plot at the Wall has been very thin this season. And so, we've had, like we said last week, sometimes it just feels like it's Jon coming and going. And, then having to report before a council. We haven't really had the kind of build-up we had to Blackwater, where the city was, under siege for a couple episodes, and they were closing the gates, and they had all of...
Yeah, I really disagree. I mean, the show started with, what are we going to do about this threat? And then there were sort of what you might call shaping operations, right, where the Wildlings are trying to draw out the Night's Watch, and the Night's Watch are trying to eliminate the deserters to preserve intelligence. So I think this got plenty of build-up. And I think there's less build-up for the Blackwater than you're thinking, because the city was not under siege for several episodes. There were preparations.
Stannis,
yeah, but there were.
They were closing the gates. They were kicking, moving people.
There was no scene of closing the gates. This is in your head.
No, there was when they start talking about who's gonna come in the Mudgate and who's gonna come in they start talking about and preparing for Stannis' arrival, and that seemed to be a couple of episodes.
I think you're exaggerating these. I mean, in this show, what they tend to do is, rather than have gradual build-up, there is much more a kind of a suddenness, right? A swift movement from one state into the other. And I think you have to kind of roll with that a little bit. Otherwise, you're just not going to get anything out of the show. Well,
clearly, I get a lot out of the show. I mean, just last week I said I think this is the best season of it so far, which might heighten my disappointment in this episode, because they've been doing so much so well. I expected more than just a great battle scene, which is what this really did feel like to me.
And I think that if you cared about Jon and Ygritte, and if you cared about Sam, and if you cared about Pip and Gren, then it was more than just a battle sequence. But ultimately, it's the siege of goddamn Castle Black. It's going to be a battle sequence. And you got to deal with that.
Well, we'll see how I feel next week.
Okay, we will indeed.
You even mentioned on Facebook after the episode ended, it's like, wow, they stopped there. And I sort of had the feeling too.
And I'm wondering whether that's another book versus show problem. And we'll have to see for next week whether that particular payoff, is handled well.
Well, they have an extra 15 minutes to do it.
Yep.
66 minutes season finale.
Should be fun.
Yes. And with that, I guess we will draw this to a close.
Okay.
All right. This has been another Lawyers, Guns, and Money podcast. I'm Scott R. Kaufman.
I'm Steve Atwell.
And we will talk to you next week.